We're back with really the meaty video for chapter 42, and this is about subordinate clauses with the subjunctive. So we're returning to these subordinate clauses that have subjunctive verbs, and we're going to learn three different types of clauses in this video, revisiting, again, a lot of those sentences that we saw in the earlier video. So if you haven't seen video 1, stop this one, go back and watch that, and then pick it up with video 2, otherwise you might be a little bit lost. This is from our Building the Meaning on page 153 in the book. So our first type of subordinate clause with subjunctive verbs is called a cum causal clause. There we go. And these are introduced by the Latin word cum, which we're going to translate as since or because. And the function of these, they state the reason for the action of the main clause. So we're going to have, as you remember, a complex sentence, a main clause and a subordinate clause. And these causal clauses, as you can probably tell by the description, by what we name them, they give the cause, the reason, again, of that main clause. So here's the sentence. We saw it in the first video. It's from chapter 42. Magister navis cum valde timeret, suos vetuit nos adjuvare. We translated that as the captain of the ship, since or because he was very frightened, forbade his own men to help us. So, in red, what we've got here, the captain of the ship forbade his men to help us, that's our main clause. So what's underlined is what's called a cum causal clause, and that gives the reason, in this instance, for the reason for the forbidding. Well, he did that because he was very frightened, since he was very frightened. The way we're translating cum there is a dead giveaway that we have a causal clause. It's giving us the reason behind it. And you'll notice, based on the first video and then the second video for forms, timeret, in that causal clause, that's an imperfect subjunctive. So it's a subordinate clause, that's why it needs a subjunctive. And if you think about how we've said previously that subjunctive verbs are verbs that indicate not fact, but instead some possibility or potential action, we've talked about this in class. If you think about this sentence, why did the captain forbid his own men to help us? Because he was very frightened? Sure, that's one answer, but there could be any multitude of others. So because that's a potential reason, a very good one maybe, but still potential, that's why it's subjunctive in terms of the sense of the verb. Grammatically, we're going to say it's subjunctive because it's in that subordinate clause. So these are cum causal clauses. They're going to answer the question, that specific subordinate clause is going to answer the question why. Why did something happen? Why did he forbid his men to help us? Because he was very frightened. Let's move on. Clause number 2, cum circumstantial clauses. These types of clauses, we're going to translate the word cum as when. So not since or because, as we saw last time, but here it's going to be translated when. And these describe the circumstances, hence the name circumstantial, those circumstances that accompany or precede the action of the main clause. So there's still some relation between main clause and subordinate, but it's not a causal relation anymore. Now it's an action before that main clause. So this sentence from the first video, also from chapter 42, cum quator dies navigavis semus, subito maxima tempestas cohorta est. The translation, when we had sailed for 4 days, suddenly a very great storm arose. Here is our main clause in red. Suddenly a very great storm arose. Well, what happened before that? What was the circumstance of events or actions that happened before that storm could arise? Well, we had sailed for 4 days. So grammatically, we have a subordinate clause. Therefore, we have a subjunctive verb, navigavis semus. That one's pluperfect, as we should be able to recognize by the ISSE. So what's underlined is called a cum circumstantial clause here. And then again, our main clause in red. These are going to answer questions either when did something happen or after what did something happen, these actions. And then again, thinking about this potentiality of subjunctive verbs, well, a very great storm arose. That's a fact. But what was a circumstance that went into it? Well, we had sailed for 4 days. But is that the only one? No, that's one potential circumstance. So again, if you're thinking in those terms, that's why it's subjunctive instead of indicative. The verb cohorta est in the main clause, that's an indicative verb. That's a fact. And that's where we see indicative verbs in main clauses. So that's going to give us several different ways of translating the word cum in Latin. The easiest one, if it's followed by nouns or adjectives in the ablative case, it's just a preposition. It means with. However, these other two are conjunctions. It's going to be translated as since or because if it's introducing a causal subordinate clause, and it's going to be translated as when if it introduces a circumstantial subordinate clause. Now, for these second ones, the way that we're going to figure it out is context, because it could go either way. So you're going to have to look at the sentence as a whole and figure out, how do we translate cum? Is it with, when, since, or because? The more you practice that, the easier it's going to be. One last type of clause is going to be an indirect question, and in these we are also going to see subjunctive verbs. So if we say qui estis, that translates to who are you? And that's a direct question. It's also a great song, but it's a direct question. Somebody is asking somebody else something, so we have a question mark. It's directly being asked. We could, on the other hand, say something like Piratai rogabant qui esemus. The pirates were asking who we were. Notice we don't have a question mark anymore. We don't have a direct question. Nobody is presently asking anybody anything. The pirates were asking. This is called an indirect question. We still have a question, right? Somebody asked us who we were in the past. But since that's not stated directly, we're going to call it an indirect question. So, in this, what we have is, which is underlined, that's the indirect question. The rest of it's a main clause. As you can see, esemus, that's the subjunctive. It's an imperfect subjunctive of the verb to be. So these indirect questions are a third type of subordinate clause that has a subjunctive verb in it. So just a little more explanation on that. Indirect questions, they come after introductory words of questioning, like rogo, and it's basically a direct question stated indirectly. It's inside a subordinate clause, and the verb is in the subjunctive. So here's a sentence from chapter 42. Piratai rogabant qui esemus, unde venesemus, quo iter faceremus. The pirates were asking who we were. There's an imperfect subjunctive. From where we had come, venesemus. There's a pluperfect subjunctive. To where we were making a journey, faceremus, another imperfect subjunctive. All of those are subordinate to the main clause, which is very simply the pirates were asking. Those are the different things the pirates were asking. So, hopefully that should make sense. These are pretty easy. The clue is that you're going to have some verb like rogo, some verb of asking questions. And if you have that and don't have a question mark, well, then you have an indirect question. You want to look for subjunctive verbs. So just to recap, 3 different types of subordinate clauses that take subjunctive verbs inside them. Cum causal clauses, they explain why something happens. Cum circumstantial clauses, they explain when something happened. And then indirect questions, it's a direct question but stated in some indirect manner. In all 3 of these subordinate clauses, the verbs have to be subjunctive. And for right now, that either means it's an imperfect subjunctive or a pluperfect subjunctive. You definitely want to be sure that you're okay understanding the concepts in this video. They're important. You're going to see them a lot going forward. If not, watch it again or bring any questions you might have to class, because we're going to be getting a lot of practice with this.